Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society interview series with prominent authors and historians specializing in the colonial period in Revolutionary America. My name is Randy Flood, and today I am joined by my colleague Christian DeSpigna, author of The Life and Death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero. This presentation is brought to you in cooperation with the Real American Revolution public television series and the American Revolution Consortium for Civic Education. So, Christian, let's get started and let's introduce our guest today.
Thanks, Randy. Dr. Robert Shimp is the Research and Adult Program Director for the Paul Revere Memorial Association. He received his PhD in history from Boston University for his dissertation, A British Paradox, John Quincy Adams' Life and Career in the Early American Republic. He is the recipient of several fellowships and awards, including the General Society of Colonial Wars John Adams Grant for Studies in American Colonial History, the American Political History Institute Exchange Fellowship between Boston University and the University of Cambridge, and the Outstanding Teaching Fellow Award from Boston University History Department. Currently, he serves as the editor of the Paul Revere Gazette. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Christian. Randy, it's great to be here with you.
Super.
So we're really excited to have you on, and I'm just going to dive right into it. And I'm going to ask you, first off, about Paul Revere's legacy. So was it formed in his lifetime or after his lifetime, or both?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's a little bit of both, but primarily afterwards. And that's something that we on site have a lot of fun talking with visitors about, of course, because as I think for many of us, Revere, even growing up, is such a household name. I mean, the name itself is really so iconic to American history, but by and large, that's a function of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and his 1860 poem. So, I mean, during Revere's life, and I think something we'll probably talk about as we go through, I think one of the things that Revere really benefited from was frankly his longevity. I mean, it really an incredible lifespan, living until 1818, born in 1734. So he was able to, obviously his life and career tracked a lot of those American, iconic moments in the early Republic. And as a result, I think he really did well both before the Revolution and then after the Revolution, becoming a central figure in Boston and around town. So certainly locally, he was known as he developed Revere Copper and went into copper rolling. That company continued on in a very robust fashion through the 19th century. So certainly through his son, Joseph Warren Revere, the Revere name is still very much out there through the early parts of the 19th century even, and commemorations around Revere's death in Boston were certainly prominent in 1818. We see him crop up a little bit, some family histories, some references and early accounts of the Revolution and in the first part of the 19th century. But frankly, it's that Longfellow poem, as Longfellow was essentially doing what many visitors and people along the Freedom Trail do today. He was doing a walking tour through the North End in 1860, reflecting back on American history at that central kind of fulcrum for the United States just before the Civil War was about to break out. And he was certainly inspired by Revere's story, of course, wrote the iconic poem that really skyrocketed Revere, I think, into that American icon status. And that really continued on or built up over the 19th century, certainly carried on, I think, in a stronger fashion over the 20th century, which leads into, the Revere House being purchased by descendants, preserved, and opened to the public in 1908. So actually, we were one of the kind of early historic house museums, certainly in Boston and around the country as well. So I think that conjunction, having the fame from the poem with that kind of place-based history for Revere, I think those two things really fuse together. And then, certainly when we see the 20th century develop, we see references in any number of ways, any number of appropriations, as well as of just advertisements for Revere. So I think that really helped solidify him into American legacy.
Yeah. Well, Robert, let's talk about that midnight ride in the poem of Longfellow. How accurate are our perceptions of that midnight ride?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the perceptions of the ride, I think, are both a function of lore and of the poem itself. Now, for the poem, certainly it's it's a page turner, as it were. It reads well. It's very memorable. For the most part, some of the aspects of the ride itself are accurate, but the problems come in mostly with time and place for Revere. And I think the kind of zoomed out problem is making out Revere to be this lone figure, this solo writer, this individual actor, which was just not the case. And in many ways, it wasn't the case because Revere himself realized that mission on the night of April 18th, 1775, could not be entrusted to one individual. I mean, the committees of correspondence and writers were nothing new for April 18th, 75. Revere himself had been doing that for several years, and this communication system had been built up and was robust. So Revere was not a lone writer, as Longfellow would make him out to be. Time and place is off as well. Revere is not waiting on the other side of the river for the signals. Revere is the one that is putting the signal system into motion that night. Friends row him across the harbor. It's a borrowed horse that he meets up with, some fellow Sons of Liberty on the other side of the Charles that night. He's certainly harried by the British along the way, and we can chat about that too if we'd like. But he's nearly captured straight away, and the timing is off. Longfellow has him arriving at Lexington at 1 a.m., closer to midnight. And then Longfellow has him continuing on to Concord by 2 a.m. He never reached Concord. That was not the mission, by the way. It's not a problem that he didn't reach Concord. The official mission that he had from Warren was, of course, to get to Lexington, which he succeeded at, but did not continue on to Concord. The timeline is off. And I think from popular lore, of course, the phrase "the British are coming," Revere yelling that, it's not the case for a couple of reasons. First, as I mentioned, Revere was nearly captured straight away when he got on his horse. He had to do some evasive maneuvers. This was supposed to be a secret mission. He's not looking to make a lot of noise and draw attention to himself along the way. So from his accounts, from what we know, he stopped at known individual houses and locations along the way to raise the alarm. And from best we can tell, the phrasing that would have been used was "the regulars are coming out," meaning the shorthand for the regular professional British soldiers. For Revere, many Bostonians, many revolutionaries, and in part, they considered themselves to be true Britons, upholding the unwritten British Constitution. So in that sense, it really wouldn't have made a whole lot of sense to shout "the British are coming." So again, something along the lines of "the regulars are coming out," and in a more targeted sense than just shouting this alarm all the way on the way to Lexington.
Yeah. I want to ask you this question, and I want to preface it by saying, when you go to the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and you go to the American wing, the first thing that kind of smacks you in the face is Paul Revere's painting by Copley. And then follows the paintings of Hancock and Adams and Warren and other figures. But I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, is Paul Revere a founding father?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And certainly I think, wise people can probably come to some versions of disagreement on this, but I think it depends on how you define it. And for me, a lot of that comes down to the political side of things. So founding fathers as those political figures making the decisions, or even prominent military figures that might translate into politics. And quite simply, in that sense, Revere was not. He was not one of those major political actors. So maybe if we're doing, capital F founding fathers, I don't think Revere necessarily belongs in that grouping. And that's not to minimize his accomplishments at all. I mean, if we're doing lowercase f's, I think that probably would be more along the lines of where Revere might flesh out. Just in the sense that he never served major political office, and that was always something that irked Revere. He did not have the educational background. He didn't have the, the connections that Warren perhaps may have had, that somebody like John Adams certainly would have had. And in a lot of cases, I think that prevented Revere from really cracking in at critical moments to the Boston elite political scene. And that's again something that I think stuck with him over his life. Of course, the other way, if you don't have the education, the other potential for the period to fast track one's career would have been through military service and heroics, and that never really came for Revere either. I mean, certainly his contributions were significant as a writer, from the Boston Tea Party in 73 through the Midnight Ride in 75. I mean, we see Revere's name even popping up in London newspapers. So he's a known figure, and certainly a significant one, but one that is meant to convey information, not to be the one creating the information. So he always felt that he deserved more early on in terms of a rank within the Continental Army, and that never came. So when we see Revere eventually work into a military career, it's you could say modest at best, and almost a problematic mark on his life and trajectory following the failed Penobscot campaign in 1779, which ultimately was the greatest naval disaster for the American forces during the Revolution. It turns into a mess. The chain of command breaks down. Revere takes his artillery command back to Boston as the thing turns into just disarray, and is ultimately placed on house arrest, charged with cowardice and insubordination. Now Revere, he's the one that pushes for a court martial time and time again to clear his name, which ultimately does happen. He's absolved on charges, but that takes years off of his career, and certainly precludes him from any greater military service in the war at that point. So he doesn't have that avenue into politics either. So Revere's really never able to crack in. We see him pushing for advanced positions in the 1790s, for perhaps a leading position with the Mint in the United States, and that you can see him trying to punch above his weight, but never quite breaks into that mold. So again, politically, Revere not a founding father, but I think again some of those contributions are incredibly massive. I would reference certainly Rob Martello's work, Midnight Ride, Industrial Dawn, on Revere being at the forefront of American industry with his copper rolling mill in the early 19th century, making incredibly valuable contributions, not just to the nation writ large, but specifically into how the United States was able to prepare its fleet for the War of 1812. So we see these really significant contributions for Revere in myriad ways, I would say, in the early Republic, but not would not include him amongst that kind of political echelon for the first years of the nation.
You know what? I can't help but think, I can't help, and I hate dabbling in the what ifs, but I can't help but think, had Warren not died, because it almost seems that Warren was Revere's direct conduit to these upper echelons of power. And had Warren survived Bunker Hill, how would that have changed things for Paul Revere going forward, as far as connections to the Sons of Liberty and the Continental Congress? And if he had continued to have Warren's patronage, that might have changed the story for Revere.
Could not agree with you more on that, Christian. I mean, both in the sense of also not often wanting to dabble into the counterfactuals, but this one is just, I mean, that connection is just such a sliding doors moment for Revere and his career. I mean, clearly he had hitched his wagon to Warren, as you well know, as the expert on Warren. I mean, this connection was so important for Revere, and it was important for Warren as well. I mean, this is an important kind of two-way street for both of them. And for Revere, we see him being not only trusted by Warren, but being able to have those prominent connections in Boston specifically. And the great tragedy, as we know, of Warren dying so early, that I think really, as you say, that cut off Revere's patronage network. I mean, that was the link that Revere had. Yeah. Certainly he had some quasi connections to Samuel Adams, Hancock, John Adams. I mean, he interacts with and knows them, but there's no close relationship with them. So once Warren dies, I mean, that's a clean cut for Revere. You lose the pipeline there. So it is fascinating to think about certainly what Warren's trajectory would have been, but is Revere able to, to stick with Warren and become that trusted agent, perhaps as Warren rises in, or would have risen in continental politics, or if Warren would have chosen perhaps a more direct military career. Does Revere, is he able to work his way up in that sort of command structure as well, and then pivot into politics? I mean, there are any number of ways that I think things would have changed for Revere fundamentally, and I think would have led into into avenues that Revere himself, and I think this is an important part of the equation as well. Revere had ambition. Revere was looking to become that figure. So you see how, Revere probably could have leveraged that in any number of ways and resulted in a different life trajectory for sure.
Right.
Well, Robert, Revere is primarily known, I know, for the Midnight Ride and the poem, and the Penobscot campaign as well. But how does he stand out among revolutionary figures? For example, could you share with us some things that people just simply don't know? For example, he was the courier, as I understand it, to Philadelphia, the Suffolk Resolves. And he did a courier on numerous occasions. So could you maybe point out some things of his career and his life that people simply don't know?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Randy. I mean, I think one of the things that I alluded to earlier, I think one of the things that always is kind of fascinating to me with figures like Revere, even, folks with just unnatural longevity for the time. Somebody, obviously, my work had been on John Quincy Adams, but thinking about even John Adams and Jefferson, the trajectory of their lives hitting so many of these different events. And that's no different for Revere. I mean, he begins, worked as an apprentice for his father, silversmith in Boston. And as you mentioned, Christian, we see oftentimes in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, we see Revere's painting, but below that is the Liberty Bowl that he produced as well. So we see some of his iconic silver being, significant both symbolically and literally for production of, American art and kind of reinforcing the spirit of the age, moving from a Rococo style to kind of a neoclassical style. So in that sense, Revere is literally kind of, reproducing a lot of the major, motifs and touchstone points for the revolution itself. So he's certainly important for the silver, as you noted. I mean, this work is as a courier, as an engraver, his famous kind of borrowed print of the Boston Massacre is the iconic image that many of us connect to that event even today. And did numerous rides. I mean, starting the night after the Boston Tea Party, he brings the news of the Tea Party down to New York, starting on December 17th, 73, brings the Suffolk Resolves to Philadelphia, makes numerous rides up through 75. From there, I think one of the interesting things for me is that Revere really made himself such an indispensable figure for Boston, as he had so many irons in the fire around town. I mean, thinking about this town that's, roughly 15,000 people, a more navigable scene certainly than it is today, but you would have seen Revere popping up over the course of his life in any, number of ways. He was a part-time dentist, being able to wire, teeth together for dentures. He was a town coroner. He was the first president of Boston's Board of Health, actually in the late 1790s, which we've certainly drawn a lot of connections to this year in particular, where he was putting in, quarantine policies for ships coming into Boston during, smallpox scares and outbreaks, having, privies dug further away and deeper from homes for better sanitation as well. So we see Revere, certainly working on that medical front fire ward for a time, running a hardware store a couple of blocks away from where we are now. And then ultimately, I mean, for Revere, we see him, again, he didn't have that formal education, but in a lot of ways, I mean, this is a brilliant figure. This is almost an autodidact where he's able to read a bit and learn a bit at these different professions and then pivot and pivot and pivot. So we see him opening an iron foundry here, 1790s, where amongst other things, he's making mortars, casting bells that end up around the country. One of his bells actually is in Singapore today, where his daughter Maria ended up over her life. And then we see him taking all of those kind of professions and hobbies, fusing them together and really risking, his family's future and personal financial security, and opening the first copper rolling mill in the United States, which was such a significant moment for America to continue to kind of cast the specter of Britain away. And as I mentioned, really build up that naval fleet, and kind of the first ships in the U.S. Navy, amongst others, the USS Constitution, still sitting here in Charlestown today with that copper sheathing at the bottom, which allowed ships to be more efficient. They didn't need to be treated as much. And that really, kind of zooming out even more, it was one of the few successes that the United States had at the start of the War of 1812, where in some of those naval battles in the Great Lakes, and in many ways, Revere's direct and even indirect connections to that, I think, helped the nation. So his service and work for the country spans not just dabbling a bit in the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, but then certainly through the War of 1812 as well.
Thank you.
So many things running through my head. Let me just get this out, because I think you would agree with me that in so many ways, when we look at Revere's life and how life is today, we know he went through these horrific smallpox pandemics, and that he had chosen not to get his children put in the pest house, and that he had quarantined, and also how he's had to pivot, right, with his business, as so many businesses have had to do today, to try and stay relevant and stay profitable. And there's so many parallels that we can draw between 2019, 2020 today and colonial Boston, as far as, smallpox pandemic, the horrific bankruptcy of 1765, the financial downturn, the horrific fire at Harvard, all these challenges that we're kind of gives us, in a way, a new appreciation. And I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but in so many ways, Revere's popularity is inexplicable. I mean, can you think of anything else outside of that Longfellow poem and some of the other things we've discussed that make America and Americans so fascinated with this man and his rise and his ride to stardom?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, Christian, I think in a lot of ways it's how you preface that. I mean, I think there are just so many, in ways that maybe for any number of reasons, visitors from all walks of life might not be able to make that connection to a Adams or a Jefferson. Certainly they have touchstone points, but I think a lot of people are, in different ways, sometimes don't feel that connection to, or have that, direct, like attainability, or even personal connection to a lot of these political figures. And again, Revere, almost to his benefit, is not that. I mean, in a lot of ways, this is a very relatable kind of middle-class individual who's making, as you say, with the smallpox outbreak in 1764, am I sending my child to a pest house that, who knows what the outcome of that's going to be? Or do I put my family in quarantine here? And this is an increasingly large family as well. Right. Married twice to Sarah and Rachel, each have 8 children. So there's 16 Revere children in total, but 5 die during infancy, and only 5 of those 16 outlive Revere himself. So we have a lot of these tragedies, which is not uncommon for the colonial period, of course, right. But we see it play out in this middle-class family. And as you say, with business insecurity as well, that's almost the definition of Revere's life and career, and taking these major risks to be able to sustain his family and continue living the life they live here in Boston, but still having that inkling of ambition and still wanting to better himself and the situation for his children. And I think that's maybe, one of the more relatable connections to Revere. And I think we see where his where his personal goals are at first with some of the early children, working in the household and apprentices directly for Revere himself. And then by the end, his last daughters, as I mentioned, Maria ultimately lives in Singapore, but Maria is receiving an education here in the North End. And his last son is the one who goes to Harvard, who goes to Edinburgh to become a doctor. And then we see John Revere become an important doctor in the early Republic. So it's these relatable connections of someone who certainly did not inherit wealth, someone who was not amongst the literati of Boston, somebody who's not, skyrocketing through the political ranks, but really has these relatable familial touchstones and professional connections that I think, as you say, in this moment of 2020 to 2021, or perhaps resonate more with us than ever in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and the fact that he was the son of an immigrant.
Absolutely. I mean, we have that immigrant connection that his father, Apollos Revere, comes over, most likely sent by his family for a better life on religious purposes, as a French Huguenot, as the Edict of Nantes in France is revoked in the 1680s. There are increasingly few opportunities for a young Protestant in France. His father is sent over to America, starts his life, anglicizes his name, as Paul Revere says about his father, quote, merely on account that the bumpkins could pronounce it easier. So, so we have those connections. And I think that's kind of the enduring interest for me, at least. And I think maybe Nina has more nuance on this answer. That there are so many points that folks from all walks of life, I think, can make to Revere, continue to make him relevant into the 21st century.
Yeah. Okay, so this probably won't come as a big shock, but we're going to leave off with a question about Warren and Revere. And, as you've mentioned, Revere names his son Joseph Warren Revere, and if I'm not mistaken, he has a grandson named Joseph Warren Revere. And there's also, military service involved. And I just wanted to ask you, can you just talk to us about some of the connections between Warren and Revere?
Yeah, absolutely. And feel free to jump in here as the Warren expert as well. But, as we talked about too, I mean, the thing that I always like, come back to is this sliding doors connection to some extent for Revere, what could have been, but even we need to look at what was. I mean, the connections that Revere had with Warren gave him a lot of the opportunities that we see him have. I mean, we have that initial connection between them, two individuals that maybe wouldn't have come in so much direct contact with each other had it not been for Freemasonry, and that fraternal connection through St. Andrew's Lodge, I think is one of those great levelers for Revere, that he's able to certainly influence. And I don't think I maybe gave enough credence to this earlier, that Revere does hold a lot of weight for his middling sorts, as it were, for his artisans in Boston. I mean, I think that is a significant point for Revere. So he has that connection, but the Freemason connection allows him to, come in the good graces of and develop a real friendship and connection, certainly to Joseph Warren. So we have that connection certainly through Freemasonry, and I think that's a mutually beneficial relationship, of course, as Warren's getting the influence that Revere has of the artisans and of the middling sorts. And we see Warren really take on Revere as a lieutenant of sorts. I mean, he's able to build that connection, to build that friendship, to build that lasting bond. And I think it's sometimes easy to downplay what that means, but in knowing, as we know, what the story is going to be. But can you imagine the bond that the two made in those moments, as Revere's going on those nightly patrols in Boston 2 by 2, reporting back to Warren? I mean, the risk involved in that, the trust that's involved in that. I mean, it's easy for us to mention it, but I think we undersell, how profound those connections were between those men in that great moment of uncertainty. So we really see that, bound together. And then, as you mentioned, just the posthumous homages and naming his son after Joseph Warren. I mean, I think that really tells the tale of how close of a bond it was between those two.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Well said. Well said.
Absolutely. Well, Robert, it's been a delight having you with us today, to say the least. It's terrific, and I know Christian will agree. To our listeners, we've been talking with Robert Shimp of the Paul Revere Memorial Association. We hope you've enjoyed another in a series of interviews from the Dr. Joseph Warren Society. Please consider subscribing, as we'll be continuing these discussions with various authors and experts. Now, my name is Randy Flood, and on behalf of my colleague, Christian Despigna, and myself, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.